program of migration policy in the Ibero-American University. And I'm here today, I'm invited to moderate this dialogue space that's part of the presentation of the report Migrating Under Siege, Annual Statistical Report 2024 from Redodem. And we're now ready to start with the participation by Sara Lopez Heron, who will be presenting the report, an interactive platform that has been developed from Redodem. Sara Lopez Heron has a degree in ethnohistory from ENA and a master's degree in social anthropology from CSS Unidad Pacífico Sur. Her research work has focused on analyzing the disappearance and search for people in Mexico, as well as documenting human rights violations. She currently works as the coordinator of registration, documentation, and analysis at Redodem. So before passing the floor to her and before I forget, I want to share that today we have simultaneous interpretation, English, Spanish, Spanish, English. So if you're listening to us from a different language, you can go to the icon that's a globe that says interpretation. I think it says interpretation, and you can select the language you want. So having said that, we're ready with Sara's presentation. Thanks so much, Ángeles, and thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, everyone connected today. And let me just share my screen before I start. There you go. Well, today we are speaking about two products, just as Angeles said, about Redodem. And the first one's the statistical report, Migrating Under Siege. What's important to highlight is that this report belongs to the documentation network, and I'll speak about it for the ones of you that are not familiar with this. What is the documentation network of organizations when it comes to forced migration and with international needs? So this organization is composed by more than 20 organizations located in 3 states of the country that generate information around migration flows of people as they move in Mexico, as well as documentation and research on human rights violations, which first efforts started in 2009. Since Redodem was created, information collected helps us know people that are accepted in each of the spaces, and also for identifying their immediate needs of protection and for having information and data that allows them to take decisions and to have the characteristics of the population. It's also important to highlight that under all this information we're sharing today, there are life stories, goals, dreams of people that just want to have a dignified life that because of different reasons, they are not allowed to have it in their own countries of origin. So the process for recovering information is based on interviews that were done in each of the shelters, as you can see in the map. All these dots show the different organizations, shelters, homes that are part of Redodem. And there's a first interview as they arrive where social demographic data is collected, identity, etc. And for people that are for longer periods, there's also the possibility of keep recovering information around their reasons for leaving their countries. And just in cases where there are the necessary capabilities inside the organizations and people have the willingness of sharing their testimonials on events connected to violence or human rights violations, that's when we collect this information. Data collection is done through different moments in order to avoid re-victimization and to provide more attention for collecting data. This has been something common amongst 2023 and 2023, a period that was characterized by oversaturation in spaces. So it's important to take into account that this report just accounts for all records of people that at moment or that they allowed for that possibility. And this means that the total number of people that were received in shelters is higher. In 2024, the second year since the first report was published in 2013, with more income of people registered by organizations with 37,000 registrations. This year was had the third year, it had the highest number. 2023, 53,435. 2018 was a registration of 36,190 people. So this reduction represents 29% less in registration, and it's opposed to the information provided by the migration policy. This unit had more than 700 people, while in 2024, more than 1 million. So this represents an increase of 59%. From Redodem, we are truly concerned with the decrease of registrations. In the unit, there's been an increase in the same period, and this responds to the increase of migration that does not allow people to move to safe spaces, and there are arbitrary deportations that happen at these migration checkpoints. Other findings that we have to do with people coming in. The trend that we see when we compare 2023 and 2024, as we can see in this graph, allows us to see a decrease in the record of migration population. For the second quarter of 2024, there's a decrease in records that goes from 4,560 to 2,400. So this is a trend that continues as of now, and we see it in all the regions of the country. When it comes to the birth country, Honduras, for over 10 years, it's still the country that has the highest number of records. Now they have more than 23,000. On the other hand, we see that Venezuela is still positioned amongst the first two countries with more registrations, but it's now in second place with more than 16,000. When it comes to the historical records of Redodem, just in these past 2 years, countries from South America have been placed in the first 5 countries that have more registrations in the partner organizations of Redodem. So this change comes from the exponential growth of countries where the people registered as they enter the country. So there's more diversity in the origin of people that are accepted in shelters. So what was a scenario where we had the income of people from countries located in Central America, such as that was a trend for several years, this reality has shifted with the people that are coming from other places of the American continent and other continents. And in 2023, we had people that came from 74 countries. In 2024, we have 79 countries. So there's a continuity in this trend. When it comes to age, the age of people that come to the country reports, the people between 20 and 40 are the ones that have more registrations. There's a peak between 25 and 40, and there's a continuity of people coming at a productive age. In 2023, there was a decrease, and we observed boys, girls, and adolescents coming in. When crossing information of how people travel, we see that most of them in 2024, the ones that travel in family groups, compared to boys, girls, and adolescents, they come from countries such as Peru, Brazil, Colombia, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Venezuela. While the presence of boys, girls, and adolescents had decreased. We have registration from Ecuador, Guatemala, Mexico, El Salvador, and Haiti traveling on their own. All this information is just for people that are going to the shelters partners of Redodem. Also, it's important to highlight how people are traveling. That is, if they're traveling on their own, if they're traveling with families, if they're traveling with relatives, with people they know, with people they get to meet on the road, or with unknown people. And we discovered that people that come from countries from the Caribbean, South America, and Asia, there is a trend for traveling in family groups, whilst people that come from North America, Central America, and Africa, they travel on their own. However, when we see people that come from Central America between 2024 and 2023, we can observe that in 2024, there was a registration of a higher number of people with a trend of traveling in groups, and that's a 24% growth. Now, when it comes to the ways in which people travel, we also see the trend of women in traveling in family groups, and there's a 6% increase between 2023 and 2024. Just 10% of interviewed women reported traveling alone, which can be connected to the risks that women face in migration routes. Now, connected to the reasons why they reported their traveling, there are changes in the trends. Between 2023 and 2024, there was a decrease by 18% under socioeconomic reasons for people to migrate, while domestic violence reasons had a 3.5% increase, which means that more people left their countries because of reasons connected to kidnapping, threats, violence, or overall violence in 2024. Now, when it comes to the testimonials of people on the attacks that they've suffered in Mexico, we identified that men reported robberies by 48%, kidnapping 44.5%, and physical attacks 23.3% in 2024, whilst women reported kidnapping in 50.8%, followed by physical and verbal violence in 31%, and robberies in 27%. Now, when it comes to the profile of who's attacking migrants, according to their testimonials, there are also changes. In 2023, migration authorities and police had the highest number of reports for physical attacks, threats. In 2024, criminal groups were reported for these crimes. It's important to highlight two main concerns from Redodem around this. Even when migration authorities and police have less reports in the information collected, there's an increase of harassing in the spaces that provide humanitarian aid to migrants during their path. And also, there's an increase of the number of migration checkpoints around these shelters. So this led to people, in order to be victims of arrests and deportations, they avoided walking by these routes that would allow them to save spaces to get assistance. The increase of reports by armed groups has to do with a context by a higher control of migration routes and the trafficking by criminal networks, which also meant that some migration routes became more dangerous and therefore less walked by people. This analysis just reflects reports of violence of people that provided this help, but not the total number of attacked migrants. This report, of course, has more information, so I invite you to check it on our website. And as mentioned earlier, this presentation, this webinar of today, has the goal of showing a second product. That's the protection monitoring of Redodem, which started in 2021, but now it's public through an interactive platform that contains information of 2023 and 2024, and that will continue to be fed with new information for people to review. The monitoring of Redodem is based on retrieval and analysis of information that's done from each of the shelters that are part of the network. This monitoring has 4 sections, and each of the sections is broken in different variables that you can see now on the screen, such as monthly entries, demographics, the reason for them to migrate. We have the reasons for them to travel, reasons or people that are connected to the reasons why they're leaving. We also have the risk situations and where they're going or where they are arriving. Now, I'll stop sharing this presentation now, and I'll now show you the full website, where you'll find all this protection monitoring. It has a landing page, and there's a button at the bottom so that we can go to the monitoring, where we have these 4 sections that I just described. And then you can scroll through the different graphs, and you can also select information, all information that you want to observe, and you see how information changes. And we can also ask an analysis for comparing years or for comparing information of one single year. We also have the possibility of downloading the graphs that we have selected in different formats. We can also go through different sections, and we see the different versions that include each of the sections. And we can do the same thing in each of the sections. You select the information you want to see and the period you want to analyze. And of course, in each of the sections, you can also download the information. Now, it's also important to specify that everything presented here is a result of the ongoing effort of each of the persons that collaborate in retrieving information from the 20 organizations and shelters that are part of Redodem. This wouldn't be possible without them. It hasn't been easy, given the criminalization context against human rights advocates and humanitarian workers. And this has had an impact in burnout and other impacts that have affected people because of the work they're doing with migrants. We also want to thank Silica for collaborating in the statistics report, as well as the development for the interactive platform that has allowed us to bring life to the monitoring of protection that we just introduced. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Sarah, for sharing the main findings of the report. This is the 11th report of Redodem, the 11th report, and it's important to speak about the key role that documentation by Redodem has, all the work they've done on migration and human rights in Mexico, and also to identify, systematize, and visualize violence against migrants, but also to bring light to what's being done from shelters, dining rooms, and homes that are part of the network. So let me remind you that we have simultaneous interpretation in case you need it, and we also invite you to leave your questions via chat. We'll try to respond as many questions as possible throughout the session, but if that wasn't the case, the Redodem team will try to answer. Now, the second moment that we have is a panel. First of all, with what they're sharing of the key findings of this report, but also the importance for the work on migration and human rights. So we want to thank for this to all participants, and let me introduce you to them as they start participating. So now, let me introduce you to Sergio Luno. He's in Apizaco, Tlaxcala, and his practice
en diversas temáticas de los derechos humanos, la economía solidaria.
Is the general coordinator of Redodem and director of the Sagrada Familia Shelter in Apizaco, Tlaxcala. His professional practice has focused on defending human rights through various civil society organizations. Thanks so much. I'd like to start by sharing the objective of Redodem. We are a network of 23 organizations defending people in forced migration, and through accompanying and humanitarian aid, we generate information and documentation processes and research, such as the report, and we do this to bring light and to speak about their situation and conditions that affect their human rights, and also protection needs for organizations and people that are defending their human rights. For our network, Migrating Under Siege 2024 statistical report from Redodem becomes a very important input in a moment where human rights advocacy and accompanying people in movement are being criminalized. So this input becomes more relevant in the context of criminalization to human rights advocates and the impact on shelters and migrant homes. And it also shows the pressure that migrant homes have after all this overload for years. And we have to remember all these caravans, COVID, etc. And challenges that for the sustainability we face the lack of resources after all this readjustment, the lack of funding, and criminalization of the human rights advocacy in a context that's more full of criminal networks. All these data collected by shelters and allies partnerships show a paradox. Even when in 2024 there was a record and there was a decrease, 37,990 compared to the 50,000 of 2023, the risk conditions of violence and precarity intensified. And that's what this report of 2024 shows. Statistics show a scenario that has the effect of migration contention on the one hand, the increase of violent situations, and an ongoing diversification of migratory profiles. Also, the strengthening of different criminal actors in Mexico. So all this information dismantle all narratives that try to connect the reduction in numbers with a relief of the migration. Migration has displaced to more dangerous routes, and it's being absorbed by state decisions. Data, and what we can see in this report is that the report has a political weight because it allows to dismantle the narrative that stigmatizes and criminalizes the defense of human rights with the encouragement of irregular migration, or even, in some cases, we've been blamed of collaborating with organized crime. Facing these speeches, Redodem, and from this report in 2024, brings solid evidence. On the one hand, the routes are more violent, kidnappings, attacks increased, mainly against women. People required medical and psychological and legal attention even when some of them are not even coming to shelters. The ongoing state actions, we have to remember internal returns, evictions, people in the north and that they are returned to the center or south without any kind of protection, and also the checkpoints close to shelters that made more dangerous. And there's migration without options for foreigners that leads to a vicious cycle. We have already spoken about the diversity of profiles. Migration in family groups grew, and migration of people with a higher level of education. We also see that this reflects some structural reasons of migration. Migrant childhood decrease, it decreased because of the higher risks in routes. Children that are in Mexico in a more permanent basis are out of the schooling system. Women from Haiti specifically, registered high levels of domestic and sexual violence. In 2024, kidnapping was the main attack compared to 24. Against mobility reasons, as we can see in the report, for men, there are socioeconomic reasons, but for women, the main reason was access to services such as education and health, even when violence, included sexual violence, was one of the growing reasons. Other types of differentiated violences, men reported robberies, kidnapping, and physical and verbal abuse. Women, on the other hand, kidnapping, psychological torture, sexual violence, and physical attacks. With kidnapping is a new way of violence against them. Information of this report is not just statistics to us. These are documented proofs that protect people of human rights defenders and shelter homes of criminalization, because it legitimizes our humanitarian work against accusations without any basis against us. A key finding of this report is displacement of the main violent actor. In 2024, more than 60% of attacks were by criminal groups, even higher than migratory and police authorities. This information is devastating because it shows how routes are being dominated now by criminal groups that are impure. And it also shows, and there's full impunity, and that is that authorities are not just protecting migrants, but that in many cases they reinforce repression, as we've discussed, through checkpoints, deportations, etc. Organizations of Redodem, we have decided to strengthen the quality of our services, even with a lower income. And this decrease does not mean that we have less needs, but it shows the urgency of rethinking strategies when there's vulnerability and precarity. Our vulnerability is not just keeping this attention, humanitarian aid that's offered by shelters, but now we are trying to accompany, to document human rights violations, and to keep hope as an ethical and political principle. The report reinforces to shelters and home shelters spaces for resistance, where work of documenting and protection in these moments becomes key, because it is a context with fear and harassment tries to freeze people. Redodem is a shelter against structural violence, against state omission and criminalization. And I could say that this report is also part of a narrative that comes from hope in a context of harassment and fear, because it shows how organizations, shelters, and migrant homes are still creating spaces for protection and assistance and solidarity. And also with the design of new tools for monitoring protection, such as the one we've introduced, we strengthen advocacy actions, and it provides them with resources so that they become key actors from the territory. In a country where human rights is being chased and stigmatized, this report does not just provide data, but also tools for advocacy. Migration is not a crime, but it is a consequence of structural inequalities and multiple violences. And it also confirms that the work of humanitarian accompaniment and the work done by Redodem is not just being complicit, but it's an act of ethics, resistance against criminalization. All this information, data is important because it saves lives. They keep hope. And that's probably the most radical contribution of this report, showing that even in a harassment scenario, we're still showing dignity and hope for the future. Thanks so much, Sergio. Thanks so much for what you're sharing. Thanks so much for bringing what's relevant of the work human rights defenders are doing in shelters, homes of the network. I fully agree that one of the things that come from this report is showing that this everyday work in shelters, it's not by isolation, but it's done in a network. It's a collective effort for accompanying people, for documenting violence and announcing and reporting all these abuses, and to keep fighting for dignified conditions. Now we have Luis Peredosa, is a professor and researcher at the International Center of El Colegio de Mexico and a research associate at the Institute of Latin American ILES of the German Institute of Global Areas GIGA. Her research lies in the intersection of comparative studies of migration policies and studies of citizenship and or nationality. Lucy, thanks so much. The floor is yours. Thanks so much, Angeles, for the presentation, and thanks so much, Redodem, for this invitation to speak about your report of Migrating Under Siege. I'm very honored. I'm very glad to be here with you this morning because I am a user of the data that Redodem has created in recent years, and I fully respect your work. And they've asked me to ask a reading from externalities and rather than analysis of data or a comment of demographic data. So I'll speak on that reading from this information. So the general message I want to share with you and that the report brings into perspective has to do with the studies, academic studies that are done on the consequences of outsourcing. And by that, I mean colleagues that are very bright and very good from the global north specifically. And these studies focus on the consequences, on the weakening of the shelter systems of the states in the global north, and a focus also on the weakening of the humanitarian international regime. Of course, this is a regime that has colonial biases, and it would be important to think if it's worthwhile trying to improve it or not. Now it seems that it's at risk of weakening and extinction because externalization is mining or it's finishing with its bases, and it's squandering this because of the persecution of people. But unlike these studies that analyze all these macro effects from shelter from global north countries, to me, this report of Redodem brings light to a different case that's visible when we use data from the field. Data on the impact that externalization has, not in the lab of the abstract regime, but the impact that it has in people. And I'd like to share with you three main specific reflections that come from these very important data from the report, and that is that in 2024, there's been a 30% decrease of the reception in these spaces, even when there's an increase by 60% of the population, migration population in irregular conditions. So from that very strong data that comes from the report, I have three important reflections that I'd like to share with you. And it's very easy. I promise. I'll just read. I'll just have 3 slides. Can you see them? Yeah, can you see them?
Está cargando.
It's still loading. Okay, so the first reflection that I have has to do with more ways of externalization that are being proved and that have a higher impact. Externalization is not just multiple in its forms. We know that it comes from binational cooperation, programs as Frontera Sur, and migration policies that we already know. CBP1, Chapter 42, each of them with very serious consequences for Mexico that has to pay huge costs for this, but not just that. It's not just the different shapes that this externalization is having, but also the impact, the huge impact that these measures are having. The second reflection that's connected to the previous one has to do with all these different impacts through time in Mexico and Mexican society. What I've seen is that there's an institutionalization process, and this process, to me, can be observed in the reproduction that's uncontrolled of ways of migration control that are not coherent with our own regulatory framework. And number 3, the third reflection that I have that's connected to this observation that there's a trend increasing in these ways of having migratory control. And this has effects. This has effect on the Mexican society. Well, first of all, we create a vicious cycle of irregular migration and how precarious they are. And in our own framework, it becomes illegal again. We do know that amongst all the complaints that we can see in how incoherent things are, we can speak about irregular migration not being a criminal act, but we take the risk. We're taking the risk with these ways of institutionalizing and precarity of irregular migration so that it becomes illegal again. And this is a very high risk, and we have to pay attention to it. Civil society and academia have to pay attention on this, to create partnership and to be in tune so that this does not happen. And number 2, another effect in Mexican society of this institutionalization in multiple ways of externalization and incoherent control in Mexico is that migratory policy is becoming more dual. And this does not affect just migrants. It's very evident, just as we can read in the Redodem report, but this opacity also affects Mexican society. It has different ways in which it affects us, but it also takes the capacity of acting away, and it brings the migratory policy to a lack of transparency. And I have some other reflections that have to do with the research practice, the report of Redodem as well, and also what I believe that we have to do together, that we work together as civil society and academia in order to avoid institutionalization of all these processes, that they become a routine, the acceptance of these processes. But I am going to leave my reflection here so that I don't take more time from my colleagues in this panel. And I'd like to thank so much this invitation to reflect on this report, a very valuable report. And I really thank so much for the work of Redodem. Congratulations.
Muchas gracias.
Thanks so much, Luisi.
Recalcar esto que decía sobre la relevancia del
I'd
informe
like to speak also about how the report documents and visualize how these restrictive migratory policies, such as externalization, are, cross life and bodies of migrants. And that's something that shelters, houses, and dining rooms can tell us about, because that's their everyday life. And I do believe that I believe that the contention of migration has become more complex, and it's now so diverse that it seems to be something very diffuse, and it has dehumanizing effects. Thanks so much, Lizzie, for your reflections. Now we'd like to pass the floor to Adam Isaacson. He has worked on defense, security, and peace building in Latin America since 1994. He now directs the WOLA Defense Oversight Program, the organization in Washington for Latin America. Correct me if I'm wrong, Adam. Now, this program monitors U.S. cooperation with Latin America security forces, as well as other security forces. Thanks so much for being here, Adam. Please, the floor is yours. Thanks so much, Angeles, and thanks to the Redodem team for again creating this very credible report, and it's a reference report for all of us. And now let me share my screen, because I also have some slides ready for this. Hopefully you can see them. So the report is about 2024, that it seems old story for all of us that are living the Trump era now in Washington, but we have to see what happened. 2024, that was a record number of arrivals of migrants in the border Mexico-US. These are all the months. The detentions, border patrol since 2024. And as you can see, during Biden, we have all this. And in the US, the response was, well, maybe some of them probably have some strong needs of protection and asylum. We have to improve our system. And we have to improve our system that's overloaded, or we did not say, this is what our labor market needs. What they said at that moment in the political conversation in both parties was, we have to stop this chaos in the borders. So this anti-migrant feeling is a very strong force all over the world, even in the US. That's a country of migrants. So I think that this is also felt in Mexico. But 2024, it was an electoral year, and there was electoral pressure, very strong pressure, of doing something for stopping that flow and that increase of migrants in the border. So December 2023 and 2024 was a record year. And probably some of you remember that the Mexican Institute of Migrants said that they were running out of money. Title 42 was already over. And the Biden government is doing two things that month. They closed some of the official crossings, saying that, no, we need that staff for processing asylum seekers that are crossing the guard pass, the official guard pass. So we're going to close some of these guard posts. This had an economic impact in Mexico. And then 2 days later, after Christmas, 2 days after Christmas, the secretaries of State and Internal the Homeland Security went to Mexico City to speak with AMLO to ask him to do more. And Mexico in 2024 did more on that. And there was an increase, historical record, the number of detentions, and they called that arrest of migrants. So we saw that in the second half of 2023, and there was a peak in 2024. Also, they stopped providing humanitarian cards, and that policy intensifies of sending migrants from the north to the third countries from the north to the south. It was kind of a carousel of buses to Chiapas, Tabasco, and other places in the south. They documented 10,000 or more at that moment that were taken in those buses during all the months of 2024. And the result of that was a decrease in the arrival of migrants or the arrest of border patrol in the border. It dropped by half between December 2023 and January 2024. Now, and it was like this. In all spring of 2024, as the campaign was growing in the US, at that moment, the government of the US was looking for having historical restrictions to the asylum-seeking right, to try to be away from Biden and to speak about what's happening in the border. Now, why I'm putting all this emphasis on asylum? Because our laws make it very difficult to be an economic migrant, make it very difficult to have access to a shelter program from their own country, from the outside. Those opportunities are very limited. So a law that was approved in 1980, where if you are already in the US, if you're already in US soil, you have the right to the due process and due diligences. So in the US, they've kept this right, but they've never built infrastructure for all these asylum needs. So the due diligences, the due process lasts forever. It's too short. And this has led to having the risk of crossing all Mexico, crossing the whole continent, to step on US soil and to say that you are afraid. And even when we have Democrats in power, it's been impossible, politically speaking, to get alternatives. Getting more temporary work permits, no. More access to the refugee system, no. The reality, the political reality, is that this is a reason for a lot of people to decide to take that very dangerous path for arriving in the US. So in June 2024, Biden's government created new rules saying that people that come in these irregular crossings irregularly, they cannot seek asylum, they'll be returned. And a result of that is that in June and July of 2024, migration went down by half, 1/4 of what they were in 2023. So you are having a lower flow of families, people with fear in their shelters. That because those two changes in the policy of the US and Mexico, those crackdowns, we call them crackdowns in English, and those things were happening simultaneously. So the government of Biden had other option. The CBP-1 program in the Guard Post that you're very familiar with, they give an option for having a registration, and 1,450 migrants could be registered every month. That number did not increase in the years of Biden. In the second half of 2024, the number of migrants arriving in the US kept going down slowly. But in the meantime, Trump was promising an even stronger crackdown with a massive deportation campaign. Not everyone in the US, not even Latinos that voted for Trump, they were not in favor of massive deportations, but many of them said that the chaos in the border and this uncontrolled migration was an important factor for their vote for Trump. So Trump arrived in January, and he said there was an emergency in January, that migrants are invading, and he stops all the asylum seeker right. So they blocked everyone. They sent them back to their places of origin or to Mexico, and they're not letting people come to the US. So the blue, green were the ones detained by the border patrol, and they were the ones that were free in the US, and that has dropped to zero. Nobody is free now. CBP1 program is sending the army to borders, and I won't speak of all the long list of programs because I could spend the whole afternoon speaking about this program, but there's a fear because of the ICE inside of the US and in the border. And that's Guantanamo Secret, sending people to Sudan, Uganda, and all these kind of things. But arrests of border patrol are dropping as of January to levels we haven't seen since the system. 5,000 people since the levels of 1965. Now, with all these deportations that are about to happen, now the attention is at migration to the south and deportations. More people are not going to the US. Some of them are staying in Mexico. Some of them are coming back to South America. And many of them, we don't know, they are leaving voluntarily. But that number can be millions. And it's an unbelievable number in just some months. There are a lot of people that are deported from the inside of the US by the ICE raids, and seen from Mexico, this does not seem to be very big because we haven't yet seen, well, before speaking about that, the ones that are arrested inside the US, it's not someone that just arrived in the border. It's people that have their own life in the US that they've spent for years, and they're almost Americans, and they're sending them back to other countries. And well, those are the deportees that Mexico has of Mexican citizens, but it seems to be less, even when it's increasing a little more compared to previous years. And that is because not a lot of people are arriving in the border. The ones that are arriving now, that were arrested in Chicago, in New Jersey, in other places of the US. And I think that I firmly believe that that number will increase in coming months. ICE has a daily quota of 3,000 arrests per day. They haven't yet reached that one, but they are about to get it. So that's 1 million people arrested and deported every year. The beginning of July, there's a law that was approved that gives ICE and border 1.7 billion for the coming years for deportation. So it's an increase 5 times. ICE staff will be double, and they're recruiting just like crazy workers. There would be more deportees, and I'm saying this bluntly. Some of them in shelters in the border, but also, as you can see here in Tapachula and Villahermosa in the south of the country, by plane as well. There would be more pressure on the shelter system. So that's how we see it from the US. From Mexico, we need the government from Mexico to collaborate more, to be more transparent on what's happening. And we hope that we need to know what their agreements with the US for having migrants for third countries. We don't see them, and we don't have numbers except from when Claudia Sheinbaum saying something in one of her morning presses conferences. But we need to have more information with shelters, specifically when more Mexican citizens come. Mexican government needs to be more open on what's happening with non-Mexican migrants and to give them more opportunities. Comar has to be more efficient because now we don't even know how many applications they're receiving. Mexican government has to do a lot of things. You already have the numbers of extortion, of kidnappings, that have the collaboration of corrupt officers, but they have to do more to punish or that collusion and to increase the probability of punishment for reducing those examples. Mexico also needs to give access to researchers like myself and many other researchers from the US, people that are returned by the US, that they said that they went there under detention or the power of ICE and that they suffered abuse by ICE. Now, Mexico is not doing anything to enable access to those testimonials. And that's of the interest of the state of Mexico to improve the likelihood of having those reports and for accountability. Apologies if I took too long, but thanks so much for listening and for inviting me.
Al contrario, Adam, muchísimas gracias por
No, Adam,
estar aquí.
thanks so much. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much for this expanded vision you're sharing in order to understand how externalization of borders and dismantling of asylum systems, these are not new strategies, but the arrival of Trump and asylum and the military are marking a milestone. Migrants do not have mechanisms for shelter. Thanks so much for your participation. Now I'll pass the floor to Gaby Oviedo. Gaby Oviedo is an Ecuadorian lawyer from the University of San Francisco in Quito and works as coordinator on human mobilities team on CEJILs. She has 10-year experience in international litigation and advocacy for the protection of rights in Central America, Mexico, and South America. Welcome, Gaby, and thanks so much. Thanks so much, Angeles. Well, I don't have a presentation, but they asked me to speak about two important topics, and one of them is how to translate the decrease of income reported between 2023 and 2024. And I wanted to add two important things here. In 2023 and 2024, something that Adam already said and that's been making progress is the policies of border externalization with the government of Biden. But these policies in countries such as Costa Rica, Colombia, or Guatemala showed new ways of border externalization, such as the offices of safe mobility. And what happened with these offices? Well, these offices represented for these countries spaces where people that were interested or that had a need of moving to the US would use these mechanisms or would request this in the safe mobility offices, international protection, or migratory visa. These offices were managed by ACNUR, and the reports that we have from civil society and justice and other civil society organizations is that these offices led at some point to expectation of staying in the place of origin as a way or of transit and as a way for them to avoid other migratory routes that would mean going through Mexico or other countries. And specifically, and the reading that we had all these mobility officers is that they had the same failures that the shelter recognition processes have, or other failure for humanitarian aid, or due processes, or psychosocial and emotional support. And this led to expectations of migratory transit, where people from Costa Rica, Colombia, Venezuela, or Nicaragua decided not to embark on a path to the US, expecting that these offices would help to have an efficient proposal where they can be relocated in the US without being exposed to the risk of all the risk of the Redodem report clearly show. And also to explain that at the regional level, these temporary beds meant a new way of externalization of borders, but they also changed dynamics, local dynamics on the access to shelter and refuge. So most of them seem to prefer to leave, such as Costa Rica and Colombia, in order to have access to these offices of safe mobility. But criminalization of human mobility led to these people and criminalization and politicization of migration.
Y de la movilidad humana, por Biden inmediatamente a finales de
and by Biden, by the end of 2024, this stopped working, and it left lots of families and people with all these expectation of being relocated. And we've been documented cases of people that they already have tickets to be relocated to the US, and that from one day to the other, all these family groups were not able to travel anymore. So what is the reading of these type of proposals, and how do they have an impact in the reported entries by Redodem? Well, first of all, family groups wish to have a safe migration trip, an efficient one, but unfortunately the opportunities that they've had and that were eliminated, well, were always with the aim of reducing and avoiding migration flows. So that is, we continue with migratory contention. And the characteristics of the offices of safe mobility and the increase of the borders by the end of 2024, specifically in Panama, they are in a framework where migration becomes something political. We see that in the migration of Colombia, Panama, where different narratives from authorities such as presidents, candidates, and so forth, where migration becomes one of the objectives for convincing in the political speech. That is, in Panama, this played a very important role, the Darien, and how this could play or could have an impact, an inefficient impact to the US and to the new government as well. Now, one of the other questions that they asked me to answer is that in this panorama that we see that there's a decrease in the flow of regular flow by the entries in the different shelters of Redodem. And what we observe, and that's quite interesting, is that in countries such as Costa Rica, Panama, and Colombia, there's a reverse flow. At the arrival of Donald Trump and the policies that Adam just explained, we started seeing people that forcefully decided to go from the north to the south, that is, from Mexico to their countries of origin, so that they can return because they've seen that the alternative of arriving in the US has decreased. And this is already seen by the end of 2024 when the US elections, when the criminalizing narratives would make families, family groups, and different people that are in migratory transit do not have the certainty to continue or to stop. In Costa Rica, for instance, there are high flows in Paso Canoas and the border between Panama and Costa Rica of people that were expecting for the result of the elections in the US before deciding if they would continue or not with this migratory route. And the ones that forcefully had to displace in this reverse flow, these are profiles, as we've observed in Mexico, high vulnerability profiles that both in their process of going from the south to the north and going back to the north to the south, they are experiencing serious human rights violations that become more serious because of the lack of state attention. And we've observed that in countries such as in Panama or Costa Rica, there's a clear attempt of continuing and that this reverse flow does not stay in these countries and that they are returned through policies of pushbacks and all these things in order to continue with this narrative that the responsibility, the state responsibility in the different flows does not exist. And this is very dangerous because we've seen that Donald Trump's impact in the region has two specific impacts. One of them is the narratives have expanded, and that is both when they're going as they're returning. We have documented in different spaces how people explain that they have suffered racial profiling, discriminatory attitudes, racial violence in the different countries with arguments set by the President Trump. Like if you're Venezuela, you're from the Tindradagua, if you come from this country, you belong to this, and in the other way around, in this reverse flow, we also observe new diverse practices that come from migratory detention in countries that did not have this kind of detentions, pushbacks, and the use of these new routes that are even more dangerous, such as maritime route from Panama to Colombia, in order to come back to South America. All this in a context and in a surrounding where different civil society organizations call it a tortuous environment. And I want to emphasize this because the income reported by shelters between 2023 and 2024, as well as current numbers of human rights violations, is translated into the way in which countries are receiving people. It's an environment of inhumane and ill-degrading treatment. And this leads to them to exposing to new transit routes where they are at risk of organized crime and other human rights violations from these routes. And these policies implemented since 2023 to 2024, besides being temporary policies that were inefficient, they led to confusion, to a lack of access and information, and above all, a feeling of hopelessness in people. So I want to speak again about the importance of this report in showing safe spaces for protections, in showing the vulnerabilities of human rights, and also in verifying data and statistics that are required for supporting that human mobility will continue to happen and that the protection of these rights is necessary from a protective role and a hope role and not a role of disencouragement to migration. What we've seen is that these policies lead to more dangerous routes, policies where new countries start to close, and even countries in Central America that start playing an active role in forced disappearance of people, in migratory detention, and in
sobre personas que
torture
han
and ill
huido del
treatment to
continente
people
de vuelta.
that
Eso sí.
have gone through all the continent, go back and forth.
Muchas
That
gracias,
would be
Gaby,
my
por lo que
presentation.
nos compartes.
Thanks so much, Gabby, for what you're
La
sharing.
mayor
And
estancamiento
yeah,
y precarización en los países de origen. Las personas están enfrentando
people are
a
facing
fronteras más cerradas y
stagnation,
menos
borders
personas
are
en el tránsito.
closed, and
Pareciera que de pronto desde Centroamérica la lectura es
there's more
completamente
precariousness.
desesperanzadora.
The Central
Aumentan las
American
personas
vision is
atrapadas en las rutas
hopeless.
intermedias o incluso siendo
People
forzadas
are
a
trapped
regresar a
in
contextos de los
intermediate
que
routes and they
vienen
have to
huyendo
come
en
back to
contextos de
contexts where
violencia,
they're
de
fleeing
persecución.
contexts
Y
of
lo que pasa es que las
violence,
opciones de asilo y movilidad
and
se siguen cerrando, acompañadas
asylum options are being
pues estas
closed,
violencias que ya no están
and also
dialogadas,
these
¿no?
violences that
Detención migratoria en
Gabby
sus
will discuss.
múltiples formas, perfilamiento
Migratory
racial,
detention,
separación
racial
familiar y cada vez más
profiling, family
violencias
separation,
graves como
and more
tortura y
serious
desaparición.
violence such as
Y sin embargo,
torture
también
and
recuperar esta
disappearances.
idea
And also
de
to
Gaby,
recover this last idea from Gabby,
los albergues en
or
redes de
that in
migración, en las redes
shelters,
de
in
solidaridad
migrant
internacionales
homes, in
donde
the networks
la
of
esperanza
international
prevalece.
solidarity, where hope
Muchas gracias.
prevails. So thanks so
Ya
much,
para
Gabby.
ir cerrando nuestro panel de diálogo, le voy a dar la
And
palabra a
now we'll
nuestra
pass
última
the floor
participante.
to our last
Ella
speaker
es
of today.
Elena Olea.
Her name is Elena
Elena
Olea.
es abogada de derecho
She's an international
internacional y derechos
human
humanos,
rights
con
lawyer
experiencia en
with
incidencia
experience
y
in
cualquier
advocacy
litigio ante
and
organismos
litigation
intergubernamentales y
before
gobiernos, y
intergovernmental
actualmente es
organizations and
directora de
government.
programas de
She's currently
Alianza
the
Américas.
deputy
Muchas
director
gracias,
of
Elena.
programs
Bienvenida
at
a nuestras
Alianza
clases.
America. Thanks so much,
Muchísimas
Elena. You have the
gracias.
floor.
Igualmente quiero
Thanks so
agradecerles por
much.
la
I'd like to
invitación.
thank you for
Me da
this
muchísimo
invitation.
gusto poder estar
I'm really very
nuevamente
happy
con
to be
ustedes
here today with you
porque
because,
el informe de la Redodem
well, the
como lo han
Redodem
reiterado
report
varias de las personas que me antecedieron, un recurso muy útil,
is a very useful input, a
para
key
entender las
input for
dinámicas de
understanding
migración,
dynamics
a través del
of
territorio
migration
mexicano.
through the Mexican
Y
territory.
yo quiero además destacar
And I would also like to highlight
absolutamente
that
admirable
it's
cómo una red de albergues no
very
solamente está
interesting to see
ofreciendo
how this
atención a
network
las personas,
is offering
sino que
attention
además
to
está
people,
haciendo
but
un esfuerzo
also
gigante en
they're doing this
documentar
huge
a las
effort in
personas que están atendiendo,
documenting
en entender
all people that they're
cuáles son las
working with,
razones por las que
understanding what are the
qué
reasons for them
violaciones
to
de derechos
migrate,
sufren en
what are
en el
the
trayecto
violations
migratorio.
to human rights they're
Así
suffering.
que yo quiero
And
destacar y felicitar por
yes,
esta
I'd like to
gran actuación.
congratulate you
Y
for
quiero
all this big
además
effort. And
también
also, I'd
el
like
valor
to
del
speak
trabajo en
about the
equipo, el
value
poder
of
y la
working in a
efectividad que
network,
tiene que
the
los
power
albergues trabajen
and
de
sense
una
that
forma coordinada, documentando lo que está
shelters
pasando,
working together,
analizando
documenting what's
también
happening,
los flujos de un
analyzing
spot a otro
all the
albergue y
flow
identificando las
from one
dinámicas
shelter to the
frecuentes.
other,
En ese
identifying the more
sentido, a mi
frequent
juicio,
networks. So
este
to
informe
me,
es
this
un documento de consulta
report
obligatoria para
is
todos los
a
que trabajamos
document
en la región,
that we all
para
have to
todos los
analyze,
organismos
all of us working in the
internacionales que
region,
tratamos de entender
for
lo que
all
está
organizations that
sucediendo.
are trying to
Yo
understand
quisiera
what's happening.
destacar
This is a
puntos
key report to speak. And I'd like to speak about
específicos
some
que a
specific
mí me
points in the
llamaron la
report
atención
that caught my attention
del informe. El primero,
on this report. So the
punto que me
first
llama
point
muchísimo la
that
atención y me
catches
llama
my
muchísimo la atención y
attention
quiero compartir con
and that
ustedes.
I'm very
Quiero
concerned
justamente
about,
leer una cita del
and I like
informe.
to read
Las
a
políticas de
quote.
los gobiernos en la región
Policies
están
of governments in the
empecinadas contra
region
toda evidencia en asumir que la
are
migración es un
assuming
problema
that migration
cortoplací
is
y
a
no una realidad
problem
social
to
a
tackle
ejecutar.
and not a
Han
social
trastocado los derechos
reality
migrantes
to
de las personas
handle.
migrantes y con necesidades de protección internacional, provocando
They go
mayor
against the
vulnerabilidad
migrants'
de
rights and the needs for international protection and leading to higher vulnerability and a lack of protection and violation of their human rights. And this is something key. This is a quote from the report because they have the evidence for supporting this fact. And to me, this is very concerning to see how this externalization of borders that's also handled by that was discussed by people that came before me. What's happening with this is that Mexico is just adapting to what the US is expecting. And they're doing this through contention in detentions, through migratory checkpoints, through arbitrary returns and controls in trains and buses. And this is very serious because what we see is that we're getting fewer people arriving in shelters,
revela otras cifras. Lo que vemos
But
aquí es una política deliberada
numbers,
del
official
Estado
numbers are different. So
mexicano
we see
para
a
evitar que
policy
las
from the state to
personas
avoid
de
that
ruta
people
migratoria
in the migratory
puedan
route
llegar a un lugar
can
seguro, a un lugar
arrive
donde
in a
puedan
safe
recibir una comida
place where they
caliente,
can
donde pueden
get
atender
a hot
una
meal,
necesidad
when
de
they
salud y
can
en muchos casos pueden pernoctar la noche,
sleep
donde les
or
ofrecen esas
have their
condiciones duras.
health
Al
being cared
evitar que
for.
lleguen a
And
estos
since they're not
pequeñitos
arriving
pero gigantes
to
espacios
these
de protección,
small but
están
huge
obligando
protection
a
spaces,
las
they are
personas a
forcing
mayores condiciones de
people
riesgo. Y por
to
lo mismo,
higher
es
risks. And
sorprendente que
because of
las
this,
mismas
it's
estadísticas
not
que
amazing that
presenta
statistics,
el
it's not a
informe
surprise that
confirmen
statistics
el tipo de
shown in the
violencia que las
report
personas
show the
sufren en
type of
la ruta
violence that migrants
Yo creo
are
que este informe es tan
suffering in the
bueno
migratory
porque
route.
desde
So this
las
report is an
organizaciones
invitation
y los
so that from
dirigentes
organizations and the
estamos
different
teniendo
stakeholders, we
inmenso
insist
valor y
in the
necesidad
important
de este
value
trabajo
and need
humanitario,
of
del
this
trabajo
humanitarian
de
work,
los
of the
albergues,
work
y
by
que se
shelters,
permita que las
and
personas
that they
lleguen
allow
y más que
people
retener,
to arrive,
disuadir o
and
cambiar la ruta
rather
migratoria,
than
justamente se ayude a que las
changing
personas lleguen a
or
ese nivel
stopping the
mínimo de
migratory
protección.
route, that these
Por
people
supuesto,
arrive
también
to these
invita
protection
a
spaces.
preguntarse cuál
And
es
this
el
also
rol de
makes
las
us wonder, what is the role
autoridades
of
autorizadas de
collaboration
migraciones
of the
con otros
migratory
actores.
authorities with
En
other
el caso
criminal
de
stakeholders?
Egipto, evitar
Because
que las personas
they
lleguen
are
y que
avoiding
puedan encontrar
people to arrive where they can
esa
find
protección una noche, ese
that
acceso
protection for one
humanitario
night or that
encanta,
assistance, that
y
momentary assistance
empujan
for one day,
hacia
and they're
los
pushing
actores
them to
criminales. Yo creo que esto,
criminal
por lo
actors.
tanto,
So
es muy
this
preocupante
is, of course,
y
a very
nos lleva
concerning
también
thing, and
a
this makes us
cuestionar si aquí lo que está haciendo el
question
gobierno
what
mexicano
the
es
Mexican government is
esperando
doing, and
mantener su
they are
situación
waiting
económica
to keep
preferencial,
their
como decía el
preferential
país, haciendo un guiño al resto
economy,
que nos le está imponiendo
and
a
they
esa
are
agenda
accepting
de
what
los
the
derechos
US
humanos
is
de las
asking
personas
for,
de las personas más vulnerables en la ruta migratoria,
even
como
if
este
this affects
informe
the human
también lo
rights of
confirma.
people, of migrant
Y
people, the
me
most
parece
vulnerable
que
in the
es muy
migratory route.
importante
And this is very
ese elemento,
important.
y yo creo
That element
que
is
es una
very
razón
important as
principal de
well.
leer
And it's an important
el
thing to
informe.
analyze.
Invita a otras preguntas más de
And this
fondo
report
sobre
makes us think in
legalidad,
other questions,
constitucionalidad de muchas de
legality,
estas políticas
and how
y los
constitutional
efectos
many
de
of
las
these
restricciones
policies
de la
are,
movilidad de los
checkpoints,
buses, de
restrictions
muchos
of
de
mobility,
otros
buses,
elementos.
and these
Otros
many other
elementos que
measures.
quiero
And some
destacar
other elements that I
son
like to
dos.
highlight that are also connected
Por supuesto,
to
la externalización de la política migratoria
externalization of migratory
preeminencia de
policy.
Centroamérica, a
The
pesar de todo, en la presencia de personas en los
the
albergues. Claramente, Honduras sigue siendo
Honduras is still the
que
country
nos debiese llevar a todos a preguntar qué está pasando.
that has the highest nationality, and we have to think about it. What's happening in Honduras? What's happening with protection? What's happening to the rights and access to economic and social rights? What's happening to the job market? What's happening to the protection against violence? Why is Honduras making people leave their country? And now that we're having elections in this country. Now, number two, how the presence of South American migration is increasing, and how we see how violence is a key or a central factor for people that are living Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia. But also we see how Mexico is creating this route in the south of the border that is Asian and African migration. These are important elements as well that show the challenges that they represent when it comes to linguistic access and cultural and religious diversity. Very important components as well. And what do we have to ask ourselves? How does this connect? And I'm glad I participated after Adam, because it's very important to think on how this connects to the application, the access through the CBP1 application. And when you were able to ask for an appointment through the application, it also shows the presence of people in the north or south of the country. That's an element, and a very important element as well to take into account. And also, it's important to see the increase of the register for Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. That's also connected to the increase in the Venezuelan population in larger numbers and more family groups from Cuba. So these are key elements for understanding how some changes in the US policy had this impact in the route, and I'd like to highlight the importance of programs that allowed the authorized entry of people. Stopping those programs has closed the route for migration routes of authorized populations to specifically to vulnerable migrants, and this is criticism. These programs where we did not speak that much about those programs with all the weaknesses and all the things we question about them, but it was important. And then reasons for migration, and what we see is that the socioeconomic reasons are still the main reason for migrants. It is true that there's a decrease in 2023 to 2024, but this is very serious, and we see a small increase in domestic violence as a reason for people to migrate. Personal reasons grow for migrating. This is a very wide category, of course, and domestic violence also slightly increased, and the environmental or climatic reasons decreased as well. And there are two key elements when it comes to socioeconomic reasons: access to health and access to job, and how important it is to discuss, even when we have this difficult context, that migration is approached including the cost of our migration. And if the factors are health and jobs, that's where policies should be aimed at, and the need, of course, of more ambitious programs, of better finance programs, so that people are not forced to migrate. So it's also a big concern, the very low educational level of migrants, and the report documents this as well, specifically amongst the male population. There is an important percentage of the ones that did not finish middle school. And I know I'm running out of time, but women in the migratory route suffer more violence on their freedom and bodies, while males suffer more patrimonial. They get stolen of their things, and they're kidnapped, and they suffer sexual violence. And we also have to speak about this, and we have to emphasize the importance of protection and the importance of shelters. Women also speak about violence and sexual violence in community spaces, in their work settings, but that's not the main reason that led them to migrate. We have lots of women that are migrating with the hope of not suffering more violence, but suffering violence is part of their life conditions in their countries of origin. That's an element that's important to highlight as well. Other important changes: people speak about suffering more violence in Mexico, in Chiapas, in Mexico City, in Oaxaca, and in Sinaloa. The violence reports were declined in Guadalajara, in Oaxaca, and Ciudad de México, in Veracruz and Ciudad de México. And those two things are positive elements, but what we see is meaningful changes in the migratory patterns. There's a reduction in the number of people that, they stay for longer time. We also see the consolidation of family migration and uncertainty. When it comes to the migratory policy, we see an increase and decrease, and see how this is also correlated to the US policy. So all these changes are leading shelters to adapt to the new needs and realities of migration in the region. And again, I'm absolutely positive that we will see the creativity and resilience to respond to more family migration, to more short and long-term stays, and much more uncertainty in the migratory route. Congratulations, Redodem, and I invite everyone to really read this report because it's a great source of ideas and reflections for all of us. Thanks so much.
Muchísimas gracias, Elena, por
Thanks so
esta
much, Elena,
lectura
for
panorámica del tema que
this
nos ofreces, que nos da ya como
overview
pues
of the
la
report
introducción
that
efectivamente
gives
para
us
que
the
sea mucho
introduction
más leerlo.
for
Estamos
wanting
ya
to read it more.
rumbo al
We
cierre.
are
Nada más
about
desde acá
to
quisiéramos
close from here.
preguntarle
We'd
a
like to
Luis
ask
si en un par de
Lizzie
minutitos nos
in
pudiera
some minutes if they
compartir esto que
could
decía sobre
share what you
su
was
mirada
telling
desde
us
los
about your
términos
view
metodológicos. No sé, Luis,
when it
si
comes to the
2 o 3 minutitos
methodology. I don't know if you
te
have 2,
alcanzan
3 minutes, if
para
you have
luego ya
enough time
cerrar.
for this so that we can then close.
Bueno,
Well,
algo que
yes.
más bien como una nota de apreciación es la seriedad con la que se
Well, I
practica
like
la
to speak about how
reflexividad
serious
en
we
el reporte de
are
la
reflecting on this
investigación
report and the monitoring by
que nos soporta
Redodem,
este trabajo de
and that
investigación. Me
supports
parece que es
this
muy notable las
research project.
recomendaciones éticas que
It
consideran
includes
cómo aplican sus
ethical
instrumentos a la recolección de información, pero
thoughts on how
también
they
las muchas
apply and recollect
reflexiones
information, but also the many
respondiendo
thoughts in the
como
report
a las razones por las
around
cuales
the
se acercan
reasons
muy pocas personas a los
for
albergues de la
not
red.
having a lot of people
Bueno,
coming
por
to the
ejemplo, de
networks,
África y
mainly when
Asia,
they come from
y lo
Africa and
que esto
Asia,
implica
and
últimamente
what
como
this
desafío para los
represents as a
albergues en
challenge
términos de
for
manutención,
shelters when it comes to
competencia,
attention,
y
the
yo
rules.
personalmente agradezco como investigadora
And
que
as a
este trabajo de
researcher, I
investigación
like to thank the research team of Redodem being at the forefront of this ethical concerns and methodology, not just being very rigorous work, but also all the reflection. And I was also thinking that the analysis of data of all these routes is a very important thing to me because it leads to lots of questions so that we can find more about this research, how policies of states in Mexico, how the institutional conditions and regulatory frameworks, and also the density of communications and the good relationships amongst civil society are also impacting the routes of migrants. Maybe some states are expelling migrants of their territory while others are more open because of these combinations of variables so that they can move, searching for mobility amongst the shelters. Even if conditions are changing when some migrants go to the north, but the study shows that some routes are used more than others, and these questions lead to more
Muchísimas gracias, Luis. Y qué importante, pues, justo
research
reconocer los
and to
aportes
think about it.
también desde
Thanks so
la
much, and
comunidad
thanks for the
científica,
contributions that we
no
have from
solamente
civil society
orientadas
for research,
justo
not
a
just
la
guided
investigación y
or
justo
at
a esta
advocacy, but also for
Pues con
documentation
esto estamos
and
cerrando. Las
for
preguntas que nos quedan
memory.
todavía tienen un par de minutitos para
Well, we
dejar
still have
preguntas
some
en el chat si es
minutes.
que tuvieran.
If you
Las
have
que
some more
fueron
questions, you can leave them on the
han ido respondiendo las
chat.
compañeras de
Some
Redodem.
of our
No se
colleagues
teman.
from Redodem have already
Háganlo.
answered some of the questions,
Como
but
también les dijeron en el chat, el informe ya está disponible.
the
Lo pueden
report is
encontrar en la
already
página
available
web
and you can see
de
it
la
on the
Redodem,
website
que
of
es
Redodem. That's
redodem.org. Esta sesión fue grabada y se
redodem.org. So
compartirá
this session was
más
recorded and
adelante.
we'll share this
Y
session as
bueno, pues
well
desde acá
later
no me
on.
queda más
And
que
well, having
este
said that,
reconocimiento a los
well, thanks so
albergues, casas de
much for
migrantes y
shelters,
comedores de la Redodem
migrants,
que a lo largo de todo el
homes,
país están
and dining rooms in
acompañando a
Redodem
las
that
personas migrantes.
accompany
Pero también es
migrants.
necesario decir que
But it's
la
also
segunda
important to
documentación que
say
hemos hecho en los
that
últimos años
based on the
son
documentation we've
las
done in recent years,
colectividades defensoras de derechos humanos que se
the
encuentran en mayor
collected
riesgo.
human rights
Esto,
advocates
por
are
supuesto,
the
no
ones
es
that are at higher
casualidad.
risk.
Hay
This is not by
pues
chance,
una relación
but
de
there's
causalidad muy
a
importante, pero también eso nos indica
reason for this, and this also shows some patterns of obligation that the Mexican state has. So thanks so much. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here today. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Sergio. Thanks, Adam, Gabi, and Elena for the words you shared with us. And see you next time. Bye-bye.